Starting or not. And hey, everyone, it says this chat is now live on air. I am Kristi. It is Sunday, and I am back with yet another live chat, this time with another exciting and interesting guest, but one that I don't know yet. We are going to get to know each other over the course of this discussion. So, hi, I want to welcome my guest, Jody. And
Hi.
hi. Tell us a little bit, Jody, about your name or where I got that from, and a little bit about you before we get started talking about postmodernism, cultural Marxism, Jordan Peterson, all of the exciting
Yeah.
non-Nazi related topics going on YouTube.
Yeah, so I guess I'm on Twitter a lot, and that's how we kind of like bumped into each other. I like to comment on a lot of these crazy things that are happening around the world nowadays. uh, but I'm a philosopher, and I have skeptic in my name, which tends to be a contentious topic nowadays for some reason. Even though I prefer the term skeptic, going back to things like Carl Sagan and James Randi and the actual roots of critical thinking, which is an important philosophical area, right?
An art that seems to be missing in much of YouTube content these days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was interesting. So like my history in getting involved in this stuff is kind of silly. So I'm an academic philosopher. I'm doing a PhD right now. So I have a master's in philosophy and an undergrad in psychology.
I have to
Uh,
ask, sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. What is your
yeah, go for it.
thesis on? Or
Oh my,
articles, whatever. Yeah.
so it's complicated.
That's okay. I know a
I'm,
thesis is a
I'm,
little look into something very deeply, so take your time.
yeah. Well, my initial idea was doing something on consciousness, and what ended up happening was I sort of lost interest. And so very recently I sort of switched my area of focus, and I'm now working on questions that have to do with the law and moral responsibility. And that's like tangentially related to consciousness, in that like what does it take to be an individual such that we can hold you responsible in the law and stuff like that, right? uh, so I recently made that switch, so I have to basically start from scratch in that respect in writing my dissertation. So
Well, I
I'm
might,
now
I don't know if so when I was doing my PhD at Essex, I had lots of friends in the philosophy department. I know that one of the professors at the department there had actually received a grant award to look at the issue of sort of like moral or autonomy in the law, like to what
yeah.
extent is autonomy represented and how are issues of self-determination dealt with in the law. And he was also in the school of sort of phenomenology and looking at the notions of phenomenology and consciousness. So I'm wondering, even if the question doesn't obviously map onto yours, that maybe afterwards I can try to remember. It's been like a decade now,
Yeah.
and he wasn't in my department, but I'm sure that with a little bit of asking of my friends to remind me of him, that I would be able to track down that information, because maybe it's something that might be a British, sort of
Yeah.
looking at.
What my main sort of thing with law is that I'm looking at right now is tort law. Uh, so it's like a bit more specific. Tort law, for those who don't know, is like accident law. So basically, it's the law of private wrongs. So if I drive my car
Oh,
into your fence, I owe you money for that fence that I broke. And then there's the question of like what justifies the fact that I owe you that money. And there's interesting moral questions that play into that. And I'm really interested as well. And I was talking to Tim about this as well, the motivator, because in New Zealand they have a universal tort program. So like in America and Canada, where I'm from, Canada, uh, we have to pay the tort ourselves, right? So if I drive into your fence, I have to pay money for your fence. But in New Zealand, they have like a almost like universal healthcare, but it's universal tort. So if I drive into your fence, my tax money had already like paid into this program that then pays for your fence. And there's interest
what?
that, yeah, it's
What?
really weird. Uh,
Wow.
and I actually think that's a better system, but I'm curious. I haven't looked into it yet, but I'm wondering if there's any like weird externalities or like unforeseen consequences of setting up the system that way, such that people are more likely to drive into fences because they're more reckless because they don't care, or like I don't know what. Yeah, I'm just that's kind of where I'm at right now at the beginning of my research, just looking into this stuff.
Yeah, I'm just playing with the idea, but one of the things, obviously, the United States is a highly litigious society, and people sue each other there all the time. And I'm thinking about something like that would actually be a real boon to, let's say, a small business. Wisconsin, in a lot of places now with the climate changing, you get very cold winters and you get iced over sidewalks, and so because the sidewalks are in front of a business, they have a duty to, for whatever, keep them free of ice and safe. And sometimes people will slip and fall on someone else's property, and that is a subject of a tort. So I'm wondering if you had a sort of pool like that for tort claims that would cover small business expenses, because this is that's the downside. People say, oh, you're driving people out of business because of these frivolous lawsuits or
Yeah.
being very litigious. But you're right. I mean, I guess I would guess that the recklessness rate is not that much higher because of the inconvenience of all the crap you'd have to go through to get the money. It might not be worth it. But it would be interesting to see if they do have different accident rate from other countries and if that can
Yeah.
be linked in any way. I would be pretty surprised if there were. There might be slightly, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because they've only had it, I believe it's been like 20 or 30 years. So there hasn't been a lot of data. At least that's what I've been told. But I want to look into it to see. I mean, 20 or 30 years of data of having this universal tort is pretty cool. But I'd like to look into it.
Okay. So
Anyways,
away from
that's
yeah. Back to the
but I
topic.
initially did stuff like more like metaphysical questions involving consciousness and psychology and how and questions about psychological reduction and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's going to touch more on our when we decide to geek out on postmodernism. A lot of stuff that I do there or did there related to those kinds of questions.
Cool. Yeah, and what are you doing in terms of your social media now? Like when people, if they enjoy this chat, where else can they find you?
Yeah, so I do a podcast with my buddy Mark. He's all the way out in Alberta and I'm in Ontario. So it's like fun that we're far away, but we get to have this podcast. For those of you who don't know, Canada is a vast country.
It's a little on the big side. Yeah, it's quite
Yeah.
wide.
But we do a podcast and it's called Being Skeptical. So you can find it on, I think, Google Play and iTunes. And we have a website, beingskeptical.net. And basically we just talk about news stories, often very depressing stories about kids who die from medical neglect for parents who use alternative medicine. Various stuff like that. But we try to make it somewhat uplifting and try to find ways of reducing these kinds of incidents. And we also do like fun stuff. We nominate a skeptical hero of the month each time, which is somebody. We just did our end of the year episode, and we nominated Stephen Colbert as skeptical hero of the year for constantly skewering Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop magazine nonsense. So we do fun stuff like that. We have this running segment at the end of each month. We do an astrology segment where we read each other horoscopes and see if like we can guess the one that matches our celestial sign. And astrology is losing, so that's a good sign.
Yes, very much so.
But yeah, so it's your standard sort of like skeptical thing.
Yeah.
But given the climate that exists online as well, like we've been focusing on some topics like white genocide,
Right.
and Jordan Peterson. We covered the Lindsay Shepherd fiasco for people who know about that situation.
Yeah. Do you want to give a little brief background and then your take on it, being someone who follows it and being near to it?
Yeah. Well, so Lindsay Shepherd was a TA at University of Laurier, and that's a university in the city of Waterloo. And she played a clip of a TVO interview. So TVO is a Canada-based program. It's Channel 2 for those on the inside. But Stephen Pagan is a guy who interviews basically academics and stuff like that. And he was one of the people who had Jordan Peterson on his show to debate the whole Bill C-16, which was the law that Peterson thought was going to bring an end to humanity by curbing people's free speech. And basically it was a law that the reality was that the law was in place just to prevent people from harassing trans people, which I think is a very good law to have.
Yeah, I agree.
And-
Harassing people and getting away with it because there's a loophole is a bad thing for society.
yeah.
No
And
doubt.
so Lindsay Shepherd was a communications TA. She was teaching a communications course, and I've seen the syllabus. And basically, the lecture, the day she was supposed to be playing this clip, or that she played the clip, was a day when they were learning about they them pronouns. But it was a grammar lecture. It wasn't a lecture on whether or not you should be allowed to use them, or whether there should be a law, or all this other stuff that Jordan Peterson talked about, right? And so there's like weird questions that go on there of why she played that clip, right? So it didn't seem directly relevant to the course material, although it was kind of like tangentially related to the course material.
Yeah, like issues in society, like be aware that this is going on. I could see that justification being made. Like it wasn't the whole, if it wasn't the whole class, if it was just a clip as part of the discussion.
But so a lot of people, I would agree with that insight, right? So I don't think the playing of the clip was specifically wrong. Like there was nothing directly, because you can sort of like cover that in a way that's you could say, hey, this is a relevant issue going on or whatever, right? But what she ended up doing was she held a classroom discussion and got people to talk about the Jordan Peterson clip. And what happened in that discussion was, so it came out later, basically. A bunch of students have anonymously talked about it, and I can confirm that this was the complaint that motivated this whole issue in the first place. Was basically some students said that there was other students in the class during the discussion portion of this that started making fun of trans people. And what happened was Lindsay didn't do anything about it. She basically let them make fun of trans people.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That is a big problem, right?
Yeah, it's a problem in the classroom, definitely. Because
So
by letting it go and not speaking up and even providing a counter argument as to why the classroom or a seminar is an appropriate place, it's silence is consent. In that case, that's how I would feel if it was happening if someone said tranny or trap, I would stop the conversation right there and talk about slurs and linguistics around slurs, and also about what's appropriate for a seminar discussion. You know, if you want to talk about bigotry, we can talk about the language around bigotry, but using bigoted language for any group in a seminar casually, I would say that's not something that we're going to do here. You know, you can do that outside the classroom, but we're not going to bring slurs and bigotry into our discussions unless you want to refer to bigotry as a concept, you know. But yeah, sorry too. That's my off the cuff.
No, I mean, but that's
from my own experience.
You know? No, and from my experience too. I mean, that's so what the timeline events, like I didn't know about that bit of information till later on. But what ended up happening was the professor and a couple other faculty members had a meeting with Lindsay, and Lindsay ended up recording that meeting and giving it to the media. And in that meeting, they can't talk about the details. So her professor, I believe his name is Rambukkana, he basically said, like, I can't tell you what the complaints were, right? Because that possibly will expose the people who are complaining, right? And she ended up in the interview breaking down, crying and stuff, and it's a very emotional thing. And a lot of people were really sympathetic to her position. But you can find in that interview, like in hindsight, now knowing that what the complaint was that these students were making fun of trans people and Lindsay didn't stop it. You can tell that a lot of their questions were leading in the direction of how do you create a safe classroom environment and how do you instill proper discussion, right? Yeah. And it's clear that she didn't do that. So, like, of course, there should have been some sort of meeting. But what ended up happening was that because of the media coverage of this event, the University of Laurier basically sided with Lindsay Shepherd because no one covered the detail about the student complaint and stuff like that. Nobody covered any of that. They all just covered the free speech angle. And so Laurier is in this position where they don't want their donors to just run away, right? So they got to go, okay, no, we apologize. Lindsay was wronged. And here's the thing is I think Lindsay was wronged in some cases. So the fact that there was 3 professors and just her in a meeting and they were kind of grilling her, I think that was a bit problematic.
I agree.
And I can understand why that, especially once it leaked, it didn't look good. And that's something that they apologized for. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. But then Laurier, they made a statement saying that the complaints were fabricated, are not fabricated. They just said there was no complaints, no formal complaints. And a lot of people ran with that, saying that, oh, that means that the complaints were fabricated. But that's not actually the case. And then Laurier had to make another statement saying, well, there was no formal complaints, but there was some like rumors going around that led them to do the meeting and all this like stuff. But in my opinion, like, I don't know about you, but if you were a professor and you heard that one of your TAs possibly let people make fun of trans people in her classroom, wouldn't you at least have a meeting with her to just check in and make sure things are okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So if I were head of teaching in a department and I was hearing from my like other TAs that this was circulating, I would not bring her in with other people. I would bring
Yeah.
her in one-on-one and ask her, just say that this has been discussed. Tell me your side of things. Tell me what your intention was, everything else. And the whole thing about, the complaints not being given because it might be identifying. As someone who works with confidentiality a lot with my transcripts, that's not the case. You can say that, the complaints that we're hearing was that bigoted or transphobic language was used, and it was not commented on. It was just allowed to stand. And so that would be my concern about my TAs having to confront students who are using bigoted language in an anti-PC world. That would actually be my most important take, is how do we convey to our students the appropriate way to deal with bigotry if it emerges during their seminars. And after having the discussion with her and knowing about the complaints and having read them, I would probably have convened a training for all of my TAs on the issue of bigotry in the classroom or in the seminars, and the university's policy on inclusiveness or how those things are dealt with. Also, do some practice sessions, like breakout sessions where students, the TAs would take on the roles of students and they would role play how to deal with those situations so they wouldn't walk into them cold. And then I would have all of my TAs or all of my professors, actually, or teachers in that department, issue a statement in their classrooms. Actually, not the TAs, it would probably be the members of the faculty, about bigoted languages in seminars, because that was the problem. It wasn't about Jordan Peterson at all. It had nothing to do with what you're describing. And it just sounds like the university made bad, opaque decisions at every step of the way, not really thinking at all about how this would look to the outside. And it seems like, too, just like letting it go and then overreacting, and then letting it go and overreacting. Just very poorly handled.
That's the thing, is like, people, whenever I talk about this, people come back to me and being like, well, like, yeah, but look at what they did. And like, part of me is like, yeah, you're right. The university screwed up. The faculty screwed up. But it's the part that bothers me is everyone saying that Lindsay did nothing wrong, right? It's like, no, she did something wrong, and that justified having the meeting. Now, everything else beyond that, yeah, like, it was poorly handled. The university poorly handled it, the faculty poorly handled it. Like, I can get behind all of that and still say that Lindsay did something wrong, right?
Yeah, definitely. And to me, too, the other thing that should be taken into consideration is she's a TA. And when you are put on the spot in those situations and you are not used to having them, and you haven't had that kind of practice or training, you don't know how to handle it, you might just not say anything because you don't know what to do. So does she make a mistake? Yes. But I don't think that it sounds like she was in any way deliberately doing anything wrong. I think it was problems of omission and inexperience.
No, it was definitely problems of inexperience. And I mean, but that's the other thing, is like, at the end of the meeting that she had with the faculty, all they suggested was they were going to make sure that she submitted basically what she was going to talk about in class, so that they could sort of like keep an eye on it, and that they might sit in a few of her tutorials to make sure that she's doing okay.
What a terrible, terrible. God, these people are idiots. I'm sorry. They might be good at their fields, but they don't know how to manage people or situations or problems. because all they're doing is basically ganging up on her. It was a one-off. It wasn't even, if they'd read the complaint, sorry, you know all this already, but
Yeah.
it wasn't her. She wasn't the problem. It was the situation in the seminar. So they didn't have to babysit her or make her feel like she was on double secret probation. And her job was going to be continually on the line, and this was going to follow her forever. I mean, this is just, oh God, they suck.
Yeah, but it wasn't going to be on some sort of record, right? I mean, but that's why they didn't make a formal complaint. I don't think they wanted to put it on her permanent record in any case. But it was more of just, and if you listen to the full like clip, like, I mean, there's cases where it's clear she needs training, and here's part of the issue is that there's not a lot of systems in place in the Canadian university system to teach TAs. And so I don't know what other solution that they could have done. And so part of the thing is, I think this, what good might come out of this is that we might start finding better ways of facilitating TA training. So for example, at my own university, there's no in-department TA training at all. And there's nothing mandatory universal, like for the whole university. I basically had to go out of my way to take teaching training courses. There's sort of like on the side recommended, but like a ton of people don't take them. But they're very important. Like, we should be, teaching isn't something that you just figure out by magic, right? you should be guided into it and taught how to do it properly.
It's really only been maybe in the last 10 years that this idea that, you know, at least it seems to me that everyone who's ever come through a university has become a lecturer with the only training they've got received is watching other lecturers. Like, that's it. It's a fact, because to teach high school or grade school or even kindergarten, you have to go through 4 years of educational training, you know, and in order to teach on your topic. And in order to teach on any topic in a university, all you have to be able to do is write a thesis and pass. There's no, there's no certification. Now that's changing in the UK. They're requiring more training at the university level of existing staff. And I know I was actually the last class that we had. Our training day was, we had a 1-day induction, basically. And we just were just, you know, I don't even remember. What I mostly remember is the advice we were given when confronted with a situation we didn't know how to handle was treat people with respect, and you probably can't go wrong. Which is good advice.
Yeah, but it only gets you so far.
It only gets you so far. Yeah. And we had a little bit about like how to refer students to the disabilities officers if they had, you know, like requests for if they were dyslexic, or if they needed to make arrangements for more time to take an exam because they were dyslexic, and where student support was. But we really, you know, this was in sort of early 2000s. That this was happening. And you're right. And the thing is, of course, you know, that when you're doing your PhD, you're usually doing your PhD and you have to have a job because you probably want to eat. And then to find time to take away from your research and your writing to learn how to teach when you don't well, the money you get from teaching, I don't know, I guess how it works in Canada, but we didn't make that much money for teaching. The whole idea of like having to do a lot of unpaid work in order to get a low-paying job when you're already trying to do a no-paying job and usually borrowing money, it is really difficult. But on the other hand, you're right, departments are going to be better off if they give their student teachers some kind of training in how to moderate a seminar, how to get the best out of students, how to ensure, you know, just different strategies. This is also, I do remember, like doing small group work, not always having discussions, or letting people take charge of things, and different ways that you can keep students engaged. And all of that is really important, because otherwise it's literally like just monkey see, monkey do. Whatever your favorite teachers did is probably what you'll end up doing.
Yeah.
You know, and is that the best way to transmit information?
No, it isn't. I mean, the one nice thing. So at my university, we have a teacher training center, and it's nice to have that there. I mean, some universities don't even have that, but we have this teacher training center. And basically, if you want to learn how to do pedagogy and stuff like that, there's the supports there to help you. And there's a certificate program, which is what I'm doing, which is really nice because they do several things. So part of their certificate is you have to like mentor other teachers and TAs and have them sit on your teaching and give you feedback. Then the other thing is you attend this like basically a pedagogy like course where they teach you tools to help encourage people to learn and different ways to run the classroom. So as you were saying, like group discussions as opposed to, and small activities and little groups as opposed to just standard lecture style. And we learn the various ways to help try to get this material across. And then there's also a portion of like, you have to attend a bunch of just straight up pedagogy lectures where you're learning about like, how to do like interdisciplinary work or how to increase diversity of voices in your classroom and stuff like that. And all of those contribute to creating better learning environments for everyone. And it should be mandatory for everyone to take instead of this like side certificate program, right? But I mean, I'm glad that it's there and I get to do it and it'll look nice on my CV as I have the certificate.
Definitely.
Yeah,
so, hey, I'm going to rip you out of your educational experiences and because I want to bring you over to the topic that I think our 32 viewers were drawn in by with the title.
Postmodernism.
Postmodernism, yeah. And here's a question that I don't know if you can answer, but I would be interested on your take on it because I think it's an important one when trying to understand our progression as sort of thinking conscious beings, especially sort of, like before and during and since the Enlightenment. That's a pretty big setup, I know. But
Yeah.
my question relates to the notion of consciousness in the modern period and the notion of consciousness in postmodern thinking. And I don't know if that's something that you feel you could speak to, but I know it's something I'd like someone to be able to talk to me about.
Yeah. So I'm weird when it comes to consciousness, in the sense that I hold a view that not a lot of people hold. Although there's one main famous philosopher that everyone knows that holds the view that I hold, which is Daniel Dennett. And the weird thing about his view of consciousness is that a lot of people feel that it's not a view of consciousness because it basically makes consciousness naturalistic. But there's a lot of people who think of consciousness as being naturalistic that don't like Dennett's view because it also seems kind of postmodern, which is weird because nobody thinks of Daniel Dennett as being postmodern.
Let's unpack these phrases. So when you say naturalistic, can you say what that means and what alternatives to a naturalistic view of consciousness could be?
Right. So naturalistic views of consciousness basically are things that you can discover using science and figure out, right? So the idea is if consciousness is naturalistic, there should be a bunch of studies you can run scientifically and we'll figure out what it is, right? Now, the people who are non-naturalistic, they don't have to be, I mean, you can be non-naturalistic and be like Christian and think that there's like some magical soul stuff that accounts for consciousness or something like that. But you can also be non-naturalistic in a different sense. And this is most famous by David Chalmers, right? So David Chalmers thinks that there's these, what he calls phenomenal properties. And phenomenal properties are what account for so like if I see a red object, phenomenal properties account for why the redness feels a certain way to me, right? And it might feel a different way to you because maybe the phenomenal properties do something different to you or something, right? Now, the thing is, these phenomenal properties are not accessible through any scientific measurements, right? They're only accessible through introspection.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to like. What about phenomenology? So
yeah, I mean, but so Chalmers, Dennett is very anti-phenomenology, and I am too in a lot of respects.
Tell me why. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to, what's your objection to phenomenology in that? So phenomenology is basically a study of our experience of consciousness. Is that kind of the right way to describe it?
Yeah. I mean, because like the problem is, so the issue that I have is whether or not subjectivity is a good way of assessing the truth of something. Right? So there's just a lot of problems in the fact of whether or not we're capable through subjectivity to really understand what our conscious experience is like. And even though it feels so strongly ours or so strongly like something, there's a lot of ways in which it isn't really like that, which sounds
No,
a bit weird, right? So Dennett always talks about these issues. I think famously in Consciousness Explained, he talks about kind of like we have this sense of unity, right? But that sense of unity of conscious experience sort of comes after the fact, right? As we reflect on past experiences. And he says that in that case, it's hard to tell whether or not it was unified from the start or unified on reflection. And then how can you say that consciousness is this unified thing if the only way of assessing that is through some sort of reflection? And once you start reflecting, you've already sort of passed the point, right? So there's all these weird kind of phenomenon that like the study of consciousness through subjective experience is just not going to get you the correct answer, right?
I guess. Okay. If I could, I'm just going
to go for
it. And this is my amateur pub philosophy, because again, I'm not doing philosophy. I've only, as I've said in the past, dated philosophers.
Yeah. Well, admittedly, I'll say that Daniel Dennett is sort of in the minority.
Right.
I think that's sad, but I will admit that he's not. This view is not as widespread as I would like it to be.
Well, this is my question, and you could call it an objection, but the way that, from what I'm listening to your description, what I'm hearing is that a sort of mechanistic or a science, a hard science-based evaluation of, let's say, how a person sees a rainbow, right? So you've got the eye and the brain and the various parts that acknowledge, and the concept and language maybe is being reached for in that moment. And to say that there's not a unity of experience, or it's not unified in the moment, I can see the critique of that, because I guess I'm bringing from it my Buddhist perspective, which is that,
Dennett's big on the Buddhism as well. So
right, things are empty of inherent existence, however we construct an existence that appears to have essence. So when we see a rainbow, we're actually seeing that whole process requires light, water, us standing in a particular position, and also the image coming into our eye and our acknowledgement of it.
Cognitive apparatus that interprets that image.
Correct. So if all of that, which I think each individual component part makes up the whole process, the ongoing experience of consciousness, to say I see a false division, shall we say, between all of the other things that go into the process, but not the interpretation or the experience to the subject looking at the rainbow. That subjectivity, I think, is an independent part of the process, just like the water is, but also a necessary one to fully understand consciousness.
Yeah, so my critique. Well, here's part of the issue. So I'm actually not sure where the critique comes in. So part of Dennett's view is that, so say that whole story that you just laid out, right? So you have all this like physical properties in the world, and the physical properties are doing stuff, and then you have the part of your body that the stimuli from the world is hitting, and then you have the brain that sort of like is using that information and then outputs various stuff, right? Now, in the brain, I mean, this is why I think like a lot of Dennett stuff has been vindicated. If you look at the brain, there is no point when the information goes in and then there's a center hub where it all comes together, and then that gets sort of like diffused to the rest of the brain, right? So the information is completely distributed across the entire brain, right, in various ways. And there is no center or locus, right? And a lot of people talk as if there is, as if there's like a display that's being represented for you, the observer, right? And then like Dennett says, well, then once you get into that problem, you have what's called a double transduction, where it's like, why do you need to have like your brain put it all in a screen and have like a little you inside your head viewing the screen, like in Men in Black when they remove the head and there's the little alien sitting inside the head, right? And
yeah, right.
And because the problem is once you go down that lane, you have to say, well, then there must be a little man inside that head and then a little man inside that head and so on ad infinite, right? So it seems like the problem we have with consciousness is just that process. The fact that the information comes in and it gets processed by the brain and it spits out outputs. And a lot of people want to say, well, no, there's got to be something more, because once you give that explanation, you've missed the orangeness of orange, right? Orange is special and you need to explain it. And people don't think that Dennett has explained it with this situation. And yet all I think it is, and all Dennett thinks it is that it's a discriminatory capability, right? It's the reason there's information out there and I'm discriminating the orange stuff from the blue stuff, from the pink stuff, from the red stuff. And all that information is out there. It's not like showing up on a theater inside of my brain. It's not being displayed anywhere. It's just in the world and I'm reacting to it.
I think, so thank you. That's more insightful, and I think I more accurately understand, and I would agree that there isn't a little person with a projector, there's not a little me watching a movie. I think that the subjectivity, a subjective consciousness would be the part of the brain that filters information to pay attention to certain things and not others while all this information is coming in. For me, that's where the subjectivity comes in. So for instance, I'm sitting here in front of this mic. I've got a screen in front of me. I also have a Christmas, this Christmas tree that I turn on because it's kind of festive, and it's changing light all the time. And I don't notice it because I'm not really paying attention to it. It's coming into my brain. But if you ask me to describe my experience of our phone call, even though that information is present and could be recorded in a scientific experiment, that is not something that I will recall as part of my experience because my attention and my focus has weeded out some information from others. So I think when I talk about in your case, the importance of subjectivity to finding the truth, one, what you mean by truth is itself part of the question, because you can be factually accurate, scientifically accurate, and the person who is relating their subjective feelings can also be, to their best ability and in good faith, describing accurately what they felt happening to them. And again, because I'm a qualitative researcher in social science, and my study is doing focus group discussion analysis. Obviously, subjective perspectives on objective facts in politics is something that's very near and dear to my heart. So while I have a lot of sympathy for the critiques and the points of Dennett and yourself, I think I would still speak out vociferously in defense of the subjective.
Well, so I defend the subject. So here's the interesting thing. This is where, so the story that I laid out to you, which is Dennett's explanation of consciousness, seems very reductive and physical in a way, right? Or at least I don't know if that's the sense you got, but it seems like
one could say that, yeah, it's basically sort of materialist in its foundation. It's just there's nothing sort of above matter and energy.
Right, but where it gets weird is that's true for the explanation of what consciousness is. That it just is that process of information processing, right? And there's nothing above and beyond that. But the weird thing is when you get into things like psychology for Dennett, because that's when he starts approaching something that people would say is more sort of postmodern. Because for him, he has this view of levels of explanation that are, or not levels of explanation, but sort of like, it's basically he has this view of stances. I guess I'll say it that way. That's how he says it, so I'll say it, right? And the idea is you can take a certain stance to different levels of explanation, and those stances don't actually reduce to some sort of like underlying physical level, right? So when it comes to human beings, you can take a psychological, or what he calls the intentional stance towards them. And that means treating them as beings who plan things and think things through and have desires and all that fun stuff. Or you can take like a neuro, or sort of what he calls the design stance, which is basically how the machine inside functions. So all the neurons and how they fire. And then you could take like a physical stance, which is all the chemicals that make up the brain and so forth, right? And these stances don't actually reduce to one another. They both have their own ontology, and they both work, and they're all true, right?
Yes.
And a lot of people don't like that for some reason, right? So a lot of people want to be reductionists. They want to say the psychological ontology must reduce to a physical ontology. And that's why a lot of people actually criticize him for being postmodern here. And I think there's a confusing thing going on. I think a lot of people confuse relativism with pluralism, right?
Right.
So relativism would be the view that everything is true, right?
Yes.
And I think that's clearly false in a lot
Right.
of ways, right? But pluralism is the view is you can have systems of categorization in which multiple things are all true, reduce to a single truth.
Mhm.
And that's, to me, clearly true.
Well, I mean, to take it on a more mundane level of political science, we know with a great degree of accuracy that if you know people's position on how the economy is doing and some other factors, you can really quite, with only a few variables, predict what an outcome of an American presidential election will be. Not any other level, just
Yeah.
president for some reason this works with. However, that doesn't mean that because that model works really well, that people go to the polls because they are approving of the economy. Some people go because they identify as a Democrat or Republican. Some people vote on a choice issue. Some people vote for economic policies. Some people vote as a protest vote. So there's, even though that several models in that, several variables in that model will explain a great degree, be able to predict the outcome. That explanation in and of itself isn't the only true thing about why people will vote for
Yeah.
president. There's a lot of right reasons for why people vote for president because life is complicated and consciousness is complicated too,
I mean, but it's interesting because, I mean, this plays into the whole stuff about gender and the stuff about race realism and all this stuff, because a lot of biological systems, in fact, all biological systems, have these weird, messy, vague aspects to them in which you can't reduce them to anything, right?
Right.
And that confuses and trips up a lot of people, and that's why I feel like these people, in particular, like Jordan Peterson and that, really like to push this like postmodernism is evil notion, because they want to say, no, there is some fundamental truth, right? There is the one true, there is two sexes, there is black race and white race, there is, and it's just a physical fact of the world. And then it's like, well, no, a lot of these things are weird, loopy emergent properties in which you can have all kinds of category schemes, and in some sense they're arbitrary,
Yeah.
and that makes people uncomfortable. But the leap is they go from that to then say, well, if they're all arbitrary, everything is meaningless and it's all relative. And it's like, no, that's, I mean, some postmodernists, in fairness, have made that leap, and I don't like those postmodernists. But it's the postmodernists who go, no, like pluralism is true, and then I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. And if you want to do that, then I like your postmodernism. That's fine.
I mean, there's no need to go into nihilism
Yeah.
because there are multiple things that are correct about a singular phenomenon.
Yeah.
Or that looking at things from different perspectives will tell you different things. And, as I would point out to my students that, a lot of how we do our research is framed by our premises, and too many times in politics or other social research, we're not actively questioning. If you wanted to look at the issue of sweatshops, you could go from a capitalist perspective. You could look at globalization, you could look at efficiency, you could look at hours worked, whatever else, regulation in the country, and you would have a lot of conclusions based on your observations and testing your theories. Now, if you're a Marxist and you want to talk about the alienation from labor and sweatshops and the exploitation of capitalism, you can go to the same and look at the exact same data and information, but you'll be testing different theories and you'll be looking for different relationships. And so just because it's not like the capitalist is right and the Marxist is wrong, they're just looking at it from two different perspectives, which, if done properly, should be able to tell you something valid about what their theoretical frameworks or practices would say about what we observe in reality. And I have a hard time understanding, maybe because I don't misunderstand postmodernism, why people would find that particularly threatening. I find it incredibly liberating to think we don't have to think about everything in terms of yes, no, right, wrong, on, off,
For
male,
sure.
female.
I mean, yeah. No, I find it very liberating as well. I think part of the problem is that it's just difficult to wrap your head around, right? I have some colleagues that like to joke that and part of this is like the problem of we're too much of an engineering society. And what they mean by that is like engineering teaches you that like there's a set of rules and you got building blocks and it's black and white, right? And you just piece everything together.
Yep.
But like in reality, in society and in biological systems, it's all messy. It's a big mess of data, and it's not as simple as just putting two blocks together, right?
The problem is that we go out looking for universal laws, right? Coming out from
Right.
that modern mentality of, if we find the rate of, how to calculate gravity here, we can calculate it accurately everywhere because it's a unifying principle. There's a right answer. We'll use geometry, which goes all the way back to the start of philosophy, this idea of coming down to certainty.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what geometric proofs allowed philosophers to do, was to be able to actually say something that they knew was true.
I mean,
and
but
that's a very attractive idea.
And this is the interesting thing, is you talk to a scientist and they get this, right? And yet somehow, like, a lot of these people, like, I love, this is my hobby horse lately, is I talk about how there isn't just two sexes, and that really likes to piss a lot of people off. And
I don't know why.
well, yeah, I mean, I don't know why it would piss them off in the first place, but they think that I'm being either like a sophist, or I'm obfuscating, or right. And a lot of these people are, some of them would be people who agree that there is no biological basis for race, for example, right? But the same reason why there is no biological basis for race is the same reason there's no biological basis for sex, which is that a lot of these systems are, we come to the table already with our own sort of category system, and then we find things that lump together and go, well, obviously, since they lump together, this must be the way that it truly is. Yeah. But then they ignore all the ways in which the system varies that aren't captured by this say binaristic system, right? And you talk to biologists, and I find most of them are like A-okay with this. They're like, yeah, I mean, it's pretty much just a pragmatic oversimplification that allows us to make predictions. And in that case, like, fine, if you're making an overgeneralization in order to make predictions, I think that's fine. But the problem is, for some reason, that information isn't conveyed to the public. They just hear the biologists talking about male, female, and they go, well, clearly, look at the biologists. They're just talking about male, female. That's all that exists, right?
Right. And I have to say, even within my own thesis, where I talked about masculine and feminine, and I talked about the respondents, and like, I had to acknowledge that my findings didn't apply to trans people because that wasn't a category that I could consider. So I only had to go with the data I have. And you kind of try to, limit these things down. But yeah, when you talk about, men and women, in my head, I'm like, and non-binary and trans. Yeah. The thing is that you just, all the categories, you can't always be inclusive. So you use these heuristics. Right. Of the aggregate male and female population. And it gives the illusion, as you correctly point out, that that's how science thinks about things. But as you're saying, it's just a shortcut to say broadly male and female, because I don't have time to talk about all the variation that exists between those two categories.
Yeah. And that's why, like, it's called reification, which is what happens is a lot of people treat these abstractions and generalizations as concrete things. And that is a huge error that you shouldn't make.
Yeah. Like, ideas are just ideas. They only exist in our minds. They don't have independent exist. If human beings didn't exist, like, the concepts of male and female would not be around. Nature would continue, but the concepts themselves, that organizing things into male and female, there would be no conscious minds to do that. So that's an us thing. That's not a world thing.
No, I love, I almost want to, like, I think there was that recent live stream with Spencer and all of that, and I almost want to, like, just simply, like, show him a sheet of paper that has a bunch of shapes and a bunch of colors, and then go sort these objects and see whether he sorts them by color or shape, and then be like, why did you choose color, or why did you choose shape? And are you sure that shape is the one true sorting? Yeah.
Or are there other valid ways you could resort the same information?
Yeah.
Hey, postmodernism.
Yeah. I mean, but it seems so like, it's so bizarre to me, because, like, I come to it and I'm like, that just seems so obviously true, that that's how the world is. And just a lot of people don't like that. They want some kind of weird certainty, right?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, these are reinforced in all religious traditions going all the way back to before history. This idea, I mean, religious power as well as social and political and economic power have been used to, in the case of sex, your entire position in society would depend on whether or not you were considered a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And that was basically, did you have power, or were you owned? And that was the determination. That that division is still very much so much with our culture and our expectations. But just because it's there doesn't, again, mean it's anything other than an artifact of historical perspectives that preceded us and influenced the culture that we are living in. So for people who are religious, I think it is quite threatening because it undermines the idea that people have roles, that there's a meaning to life. And if you don't have, if you can't place somebody who's non-binary or someone who's trans in that worldview, that's a threat, I think, directly to it, because it undermines the notion that there are natural roles for men and women, and men and women are the only categories that you can be, because then we know who has the power.
Yeah, we got to stuff them into this box somehow. We just got to fit them in.
Yeah,
aggressively.
Yes. Do we tell them to be a man, or we say like go make yourself look nice, go get yourself ready to go outside so that people will think that you're pretty?
Are you familiar with the work? I think his name is Thomas Laqueur. Laqueur. I don't know. So he wrote a book called Making Sex. And the really interesting thing is that he argues that back in, well, basically Aristotle, right? So Aristotle came up with a one-sex system. And the basic idea was that there's only one sex. It just so happens that women are a more deficient version of the one sex, right?
Right.
And
Which is lovely on, by the way.
Well, the interesting thing that happened because of this was throughout most of medical history, if you look at like anatomical drawings of male and female anatomy, they tried to make the female anatomy look more male to like vindicate Aristotelian like one sex view of sex. So you can look at like old historical anatomical drawings and see like these weird horn shapes coming out of the uterus.
What?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Whoa.
And it's like, and then you have to wonder, like, did they purposely do that knowing they were adding that stuff because they wanted to vindicate, or they didn't want to, like, say, get chastised for not vindicating Aristotle? Or did they do it because they wanted to see these things there and interpreted shit in weird ways, right? But yeah, it's weird how that happened. And then it's only till like later in history when you started actually thinking of sex as these two separate things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the further question you can ask is, if we went from a one sex to a two sex, why not to Anno Fausto Sterling's five sex model, or into like some weird spectrum model? Like to say that one of these models is the correct model to use when discussing sex is just weird to me.
To me, a good measure should capture the thing it's trying to measure, right? The problem with a dichotomous sort of male-female box for asking people what their sex is that you're going to lose data.
Yeah.
Because there are people who can't answer that question by answering either of those two options. And so for me, that's a bad measure because you're losing data. A better measure to me is the one that captures all of the responses that are possible in a population. That to me is a really good measure, because then you have the options of putting certain groups together or taking groups out and playing with subpopulations or whatever else. You have the most flexibility with your data. So for me, just from a measurement standpoint, the idea of only having a sex binary just is a terrible measurement idea, given where we are in a society now and how people are identifying. If we don't measure it, if we don't measure it, we can't say that it exists.
Yeah.
So the first thing we have to do is acknowledge it and measure it to be good scientists.
No, I totally agree. I mean, a lot of people complain because they'll be like, well, they're just sort of like aberrations or abnormalities in the thing.
So are redheads.
And I don't, pardon? Yeah, so are redheads, yeah. Well, I mean, like, even 1% of the pop, because I think it's something like intersex people make close to 1.5% of the population or something. I mean, but that's still a big number of people. Like, that's not an insignificant amount of people.
If there are 7 billion people in the world, 1% of 7 billion is a lot. Those are
that's 1 out of 100 people. So that's like in a classroom of 300 kids. 3 of them are probably intersex. Yeah.
So again, just because it's small doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You can't just say, oh, there's not a lot of them, therefore what? You're just going to discount their existence? No, not if you want to be a good scientist. If you want to be a good scientist, you want to understand the phenomenon itself. You don't want to impose artificial constraints on your data set that are going to make you blind to things that you could observe if you just measured it.
But I always like to point out too that like it seems to me that people who make those kind of arguments just don't actually understand evolution. In the sense that like evolution it like allows for variation. There just always is variation, right?
That's kind of the point, is that you get things that enter into a new world. You get a rapid amount of variation because there's a lot of things being tried out, and then eventually it's sort of like whittled down over time to the ones that are successful in that environment. So yeah, if we didn't have variation, we would die off. Life wouldn't have continued. So of course we need variation. I mean, it's not like the genes know what they're doing. It's just a natural consequence of reproduction, especially sexual reproduction.
Yeah. My wife and son might be coming home, so you might hear some children or child laughing in the background. But
oh, that'd be
I don't
lovely.
know.
Should we talk a bit more about postmodernism, though, itself as a concept and why it's contentious? I know we kind of talked a little bit around the edges, but do you want to talk a bit about the background of postmodernism as a school of thought?
I mean, I always find this difficult as well because
Yeah, I know. Where do you draw from?
well, I
It
mean,
depends on what discipline you want to talk about.
it's not only that. I mean, I find it difficult, like sort of like lumping all a bunch. I mean, because here's the thing, right? If we're talking about social groups and how you lump them all together, I mean, the same problems are going to apply to postmodernism itself, right? Who gets included as membership into postmodernism, right? Which is the funny thing with Dennett. I mean, there's some scholars who think Dennett is a postmodernist. Dennett doesn't like to identify as a postmodernist. He's written papers criticizing postmodernism, right?
The author is dead.
Yeah. So it's just like who do you lump into what? And to me, it just seems like the history of postmodernism seems to just be, in some sense, about encouraging a kind of self-reflective skepticism and acknowledging that a lot of categorizations are due to a sort of like arbitrary way of doing it, right? And again, that's manifests itself in different kinds of postmodernists, as I said, right? You have the sort of like relativistic, more relativistic kind of postmodernists, and you have the more pluralistic. And so there's even divisions among postmodernists of like how to take this, right? And then so to make some sort of like general claim, just like to make a general claim about all Muslims or all feminists, I don't think you can make a general claim about like all postmodernists being some sort of like evil cabal trying to indoctrinate students with cultural Marxism.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a good answer. I think it's a fair and accurate answer and an honest one. So that's good. And I think that's, this walking this line about exposing principles or assumptions as being constructed and not having inherent meaning. So I want to unpack this a little bit. We talked about the nihilism, the charge that postmodernism is moral relativism, says that everything is the same. Whereas you mentioned very accurately, it's more about the pluralism side of it. But there is still a break. If you come into postmodernism with a modernist sort of Enlightenment way of thinking about the world, the Enlightenment very much assumed a kind of a lot of, whether it was a deist perspective or a theist perspective, there was an assumption of meaning, planning, purpose, a telos, a goal behind things. The notion of progressive evolution, for instance, even would be part of that. Human beings are improving over time. Our societies are getting more moral over time. And the goal is to be the most moral society. That idea, I think, it mixes up our goals with what is being seen in the world. And postmodernism, by exposing that thinking as fallacious, makes one perhaps look back at the subjective, and not subjective, but the arbitrary in some ways, way that we get our values and values and ethics. And therefore, the challenge becomes to, at least that's what I went through internally when I became an atheist, a reconstruction of my values. In this case, I used humanism as a moral principle to give moral weight to my decisions, to my values, to my moral principles. So I don't have to rely on God having the objective truth to feel that my values have weight. I know they have weight because I've thought about them. But for people taking that away, postmodernism doesn't replace it with anything.
No.
It just says, hey, you know what? This idea that we are moving progressively as a society and morally, like, you know, that's not really a thing. Like, you tell yourselves it's a thing, but it's not really the case. And there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. And then suddenly you're kind of forced to confront this beautiful lie that's taken away, and there's nothing to replace it except the reality of what you now have to deal with in terms of your moral obligations to your own internal logic. So, sorry, I'm kind of rambling on a little bit.
I mean, like this, I think the interesting thing is, in a weird way, a lot of these kind of postmodernist critiques against progress actually accounts for why we need a kind of, or why, not that we need, but that why some forms of liberalism are palatable. Which is interesting that these critiques of postmodernism is coming from these people who like to self-identify as liberals, right?
So can you unpack what you mean by liberal and then explain that idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, liberal is just a weird, wishy-washy sort of term too. Right. But like, but I just mean in the sense of, I mean, there's a lot of liberal thinkers that really don't like the idea of progress, right? So you have Karl Popper's attack on historicism, which was the Marxist conception of like there being an end of history and we're progressing towards it. And you have people like John Gray as well that sort of attack this notion that like, or John Gray and Chris Hedges, which attack this notion that human beings are morally progressing in some sort of like unique way, that we're going to obtain some sort of like moral utopia, right? And the thing is, like, it seems like what's happening is that there is no progress, right? We're as the election that happened in the United States recently, we're apt to backtrack into moral depravity, right?
Yeah.
And so
make a good case for that.
Yeah. So the idea is like having a kind of robust liberal system in which we appreciate difference and try to work together. Not assuming that in doing so we're going to reach some utopia, but that it's just the way to do it so that we all get along. Seems like a worthy thing to try to obtain, right? At least I think.
But do so from a conscious perspective.
Right. Because you know, like there's no way that it's just going to inevitably go to some sort of utopian ideal that we're marching towards progress or some.
Right. I do want to say that Garland in the chat said that I was wrong that Deleuze offered a replacement. So if anyone wants to curl up with a bit of French philosophy, I suggest, yeah, that's a great way to spend a Sunday night. Go read some Deleuze. So I just wanted to throw that correction in there from the chat.
See, I avoid a lot of the. I don't like this divide between, or to think of those people as just being what postmodernism is. I find that more to be like the Continental analytic divide in philosophy.
I think I would totally agree on characterizing, you know, like the Continental and analytic divide in Western philosophy, definitely.
And I'm not a big fan of Continental, but not because of any substantial reason. I just really can't stand reading their writing.
No, I was actually at Essex. It's a Continental school, basically. So I was surrounded by people doing their PhDs on Deleuze and Heidegger, Derrida, Nietzsche. It was Kierkegaard was also in that mix. So yeah, I actually have more exposure to the Continental philosophers than I do to the analytics, aside from, let's say, Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein. So
yeah. Although a lot of people, Wittgenstein's in this weird position where, again, he's hard to place. A lot, yeah.
He's got his early work. The Tractatus is early.
But again, I mean, like, I find that I'm the guy who likes the middle people in a way, in the sense, right? So like, and part of this is because one of my favorite sort of metaphysical position is I'm pretty much a pragmatist, and the going back to like early pragmatists like William James, Dewey, and Charles Peirce and stuff like that, right? Which is the idea of trying to find what the like ultimate truth is. It's like the wrong way of going about it. It's about what works. Does it work? Can we use it? Is this a good way of doing things?
It's
Right?
Moneyball.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just watched Moneyball for the first time last night. And the thing is that I also have dated baseball fans, so I knew all about cybermetrics, but I hadn't watched the film till last night. So, the pragmatism, very much the philosophy, it's within, Moneyball falls within the pragmatism school of baseball.
Yeah, I mean, like the worry there is like some people think of have like this false notion of pragmatism as being this like cold, calculated kind of thing, but it's like you can also like add moral dimensions to it, right? You could think of, well, what is a pragmatic way of doing this for the good of people, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily how do I make more money. Let's
No, and on that point, I just wanted to say there was an article recently that I retweeted out on my Twitter feed that was a critique similar to the one you're making, and or postmodernism makes, saying that like liberal democracy will not inevitably lead to gender equality. That just because you have a democracy, even a liberal democracy, where rights are enshrined by law, that's not going to, in and of itself, bring about gender equality. You have to do more. You have to actually specify what your gender equality should look like, and then enact policies and do what you need to in order to achieve that goal so that you can optimize your society. And that's the same thing. It's a very valid critique. And the assumptions that somehow things are going to work out or we're in a good system so things are going to get better. As someone here, Arthur Hoffert, mentions in the chat, Popper criticizing historicism isn't an attack on progressivism itself, but rather an attack on the idea that we should content ourselves with an unfalsifiable inevitability of history.
Right.
We have really awesome people in the chat, by the way. So all the nerds, shout out to all the nerds in the chat. You guys rock.
I mean, I always find progressivism to be a weird label. I mean, I guess I would find myself in agreement with a lot of progressivists, but it's just like, to me, it's like, I mean, you're progressing towards your own goal, right? It's not that postmodernism is saying that you shouldn't. I mean, it's not that they're saying you shouldn't strive to make a more moral society.
No, definitely not. No, I don't think that postmodernism speaks to that part of it at all, because that comes down to sort of like moral philosophy and how are you going to, have those contestations, but you can't get them inherently from a framework.
Yeah, the worry is just instilling some sort of like inherent purpose to that progress, like that it's inevitable or anything like that. Yeah.
For me, the word progressive is also, there's the historical progressivism of the 1920s, where being from Wisconsin, I learned Wisconsin history and was always very proud of fighting Bob LaFollette, our senator, progressive senator from Wisconsin. And at the time, it was the Republican Party that was at the forefront of trying to deal with government corruption. So it was the time of temperance, trying to deal with the problems of alcoholism and the destruction of the family through a very poorly thought out idea of the federal banning of alcohol. But also, that's when the Sunshine Laws came in. There was a lot of reform of elections, nonpartisan elections, and primaries were reformed in the state of Wisconsin and other places too. Child labor laws came in. Other union-based reforms of the workplace came in. And it was a time where people who had moved to the city to work in factories who came in with no rights actually began to have their living styles or their living standards raised and their quality of life improved. So for me, progressivism in some ways is that spirit of reforming our politics in such a way that our societies allow for people to live in an optimized way to realize their own potentials. And maybe that means doing a job you don't love, but you have a hobby you love on the side. I mean, I'm not saying everyone has to have the perfect job and you have to live in an utopia. Someone's going to have to pick up garbage. But you know what? Those people should be really well paid because they're picking up my garbage. And that's a privilege. I'm happy to pay for it, to not deal with my garbage after it leaves my doorstep and goes in the bin. And I think looking at the society from that point of view, as opposed to valuing people who can make themselves money, those are the kinds of questions that you can then ask. But yeah, I'm kind of getting off topic. So.
Yeah, I mean, bringing it kind of full circle. I mean, this is kind of why I changed my focus for my dissertation, in part because I find my views on consciousness and all that, I mean, a lot of people have already written about it, and I kind of agree with those people already. And it feels like moving into the moral or legal realm and trying to sort out what is the best way to organize this society? I mean, it seems like a way more interesting question to me right now. And
Yeah, fair enough. I
trying to,
always
yeah,
characterize the PhD into sort of 3 phases, because in the UK it was basically a 3-year process with a 1-year extension that most people needed. But the first year was, what the hell is my question?
yeah,
Because it does take you some time. Like you said, you had to read around, and some of it you go in thinking you're going to do one thing, and then you read further and you realize it's not going to work. So then you have to keep reading and find something else. Second problem is, what the hell is my answer?
yeah,
And that's, you know what your question is, and you're trying to figure out what your thesis is going to be about. And then the third year is, how the hell am I going to write this up in time?
yeah.
So that's basically like my experience of doing a PhD.
No, that sounds about right. I got to do it in a bit more of a faster timeline, but yeah.
I ended up having to, yeah, because I wanted to apply for this British Academy postdoctoral fellowship. I got it done in like 3 years and 2 months or something to submit it in time to be considered. So, yeah, I was also like just banging it out, going, owie, 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 I hate writing. I hate it. It hurts, it
Yeah.
hurts, it hurts. But you just got to sit there and bang it out. So.
Yep. No, it'll get done. This thing is like it's always this like sense of like dread of just like, oh my god, I have to do this thing. Paid all this money to do this thing, and now I have to do it.
Now I have to do it. That's how I feel when I get a grant.
Yeah,
You're like, oh,
yeah,
I really want this money. I can do this. I can do that. And like, congratulations, we're going to give you. I'm like, oh shit, now I got to do it.
yeah.
But Garland in the chat asks, is a problem of doing a PhD is searching for a question that hasn't been answered before?
Part of it.
Is a problem of doing a PhD searching for a question that hasn't been answered before? You give your answer, then I'll give mine.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where a lot of people have answered similar questions, but it's about carving your own sort of like niche, right? So like I had a difficulty in that I was trying to carve a niche with, say, Dennett, in that like I really like everything that he says almost on this subject. So I was like, okay. But then I found that like I couldn't say that much more. Like I was searching for how I would add my own thoughts to this, and just finding that I'm just agreeing. And then that's a problem, because you don't want to just go point to this person over here and say he got it right. Like that's not how to how to write a thesis, right? So there is a sense in which you want to make sure that you are doing something kind of unique, but of course you have to realize that there's a lot of people doing research, and there's a lot of people dealing with the same questions that you're dealing with, and so there's going to be some sense in which a lot of people are already in the same ballpark as you, but you got to carve your own niche, basically.
My experience was, because I was doing a data-based, a statistical thesis. But in the same department, sorry, excuse me. Several of my friends were doing theory theses, and I noticed a pattern, which is for people like me who were going to do a quants-based analysis, the challenge was finding a gap in the literature. So the challenge was finding the question, because you had to read and read and read and really understand your topic. And then when you understand your topic really well, you can see gaps between the studies, or you can see
Yeah.
spaces that need new data, or a new approach or a new theory can be applied to the same data. So once you have your question, then it's super easy to do the rest of your PhD in terms of where it goes, because you have to find the appropriate data, you read up on the theory, you develop your hypothesis derived from the theory, you run your models, you test your models to make sure they're, like not missing some important variable. And then you write up your results, and then you say what you're going to do next. The
Yeah.
problem is, for empirical people, is getting the questions, because it takes a lot of understanding the topic. For
I
my
mean, as
theorist
similar.
friends,
Well, yeah,
sorry,
as
I should
similar.
just finish. Yeah. So
Yeah.
my theorist friends, they had a really easy time coming up with super interesting questions, but then they had to go read everything everybody had ever written on those questions. And so answering the question became the really hard part, because you had all this data that you had to synthesize and say something new about. So for the quants people, the hard part was getting to the right question. And for the theory people, it was getting a robust answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting with analytical philosophy, because part of the thing is you're often struggling with questions that people have been struggling with for a very long time. right? And that's not to say that philosophy isn't getting us anywhere, or we're just like rehashing the same old fights, but it's that, you know, if I were to, so I did my master's thesis on issues involving free will, and the issue there is, I mean, that's a problem that people have been discussing free will since basically since people have
Ever?
been writing.
Yeah, exactly.
So
That's a really long lit review.
yeah. And of course I didn't read everything that, right. But it's more of like realizing what are the moves in the debate and where are they contemporarily, right? So where have we gotten in the moves in the debate? And then it's just finding a place to sort of like situate yourself, right? So a lot of my master's thesis was just maneuvering between people going, well, this guy thinks this, and this woman over here thinks this, and then trying to like, why are they both sort of right and wrong at the same time? And here's my own little niche to situate myself in, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the difficulty is finding, I mean, because you can go into a lot of dead ends, which is what I did with the consciousness stuff. It's like I searched for a niche and just couldn't find it. I just found myself agreeing with someone that already had written about it, right? And then if you don't have anything to add, you're kind of like stuck, right? So yeah, go to where you can find a niche and then burrow in and make it yours is kind of the best example I have of that. There's this like one philosopher again who did phenomenology, so not my favorite field, but what she did was she found that a lot of people who studied phenomenology did so about mainly about vision. And so she came in and was like, I'm going to be the smell scholar.
Sorry, what for some reason your mic cut out for me at least.
Oh.
Can you say again what the topic was?
Right. So most phenomenology people study vision. And she was like, I'm going to be the smell person. And just basically published a ton of stuff on the phenomenology of olfaction, which is the study of smell. And she got like tenure track and she's publishing. It's just like, right? Like she found a niche. Like everyone was talking about vision. And she's like, I'm going to do smell. And just like carved out a niche and is now an academic and is working. So that's what you got to do. But I mean, it's not easy, but that's how to do it.
I had a friend who did his doctoral thesis on the phenomenology of synesthesia.
Ah, yes.
So, yeah, a lot of cool questions. Answering them gets a bit tougher.
For sure.
One thing I just sort of slightly related, you mentioned the Richard Spencer stream that went on earlier in this week, or not his stream, it was the Worski stream. One of the participants was Sargon of Akkad, and he was dropping in some Locke and Thomas Paine. So clearly Carl's been doing a little bit of reading, or at least sparked him. And I was...
He needs to read his Rawls, though. That's
Well, this is it. He's got to work his way up to the 20th century. He's still in the 18th century. So, you know, get him go through some Rousseau first. But one person that I wanted to bring up, just because he's a little bit of a philosopher, also political philosophy, and I was been thinking about since listening to Carl's appeals to Locke, is Hobbes. And he's always been one of my favorite political philosophers. Not because like because I'll tell you why, because he makes such good arguments. And this again comes down to that influence of geometry and philosophy, that Hobbes was a great admirer of geometric proofs and that kind of analytic, rigorous thinking where you could start from first principles, axiomatic statements, and then build on those. And his writing, I mean, Leviathan, and the way he lays it out and presents his arguments in terms of the role of the individual in the state and the succession of power over to a Leviathan and what benefits that provides you as a member of a society, I think is the clearest writing on political philosophy that exists.
No, I was listening to your conversation with Kevin yesterday, and when you were talking about Locke and Rousseau, I in the chat wrote, "Make Thomas Hobbes great again."
Excellent. All right, two Hobbesians in the room.
But you didn't notice it, because like I was surprised you didn't mention Hobbes there. I mean, yeah, I find Hobbes is great. Yeah, I really like Hobbes. No, I mean I will say, as much as I'm not a fan of a lot of Carl's politics, that, and here's the thing, he every once in a while had like a really nice point against the ethnostate. And it's just like, bring it home. But he failed to just bring it home and put like Spencer's feet to the fire. He like let a lot of the good points go, and that like really frustrated me.
I think the problem is he doesn't understand what's a good point and what's just a point scoring point.
Maybe, I don't know.
think,
I feel like he treated the thing like a joke almost. Like he was laughing a
yeah,
lot, and like it was like if you
answering
took it more
questions with
seriously, yeah,
questions.
yeah. Because like there was the one point where he was like, what if this is the one point that he made, because I didn't watch the whole thing. I like tuned in and out because it was just I couldn't handle it. But
Shit show.
yeah, there was one point that he made where he was like, how would you be able to identify, say, a Jew who identifies as white and is sort of like there's no genetic test to know that they're the kind of white that you think they are or not, right? And what if they're in your society incognito? What then? And then it's or like, how do you get them out of your society? Because you want to create the ethno state, right? And they just sort of like dodged the question. And it's like, sorry, like if Sargon really pushed that line, I mean, because there is no test that they could do. There's no way that they could make it pure because, again, race is arbitrary. So there's no test that you could do to figure out whether this person is officially white in the sense that they want, right? But he didn't push it. Yeah. He just sort of laughed it off and like let it, or Carl just laughed like, ha ha ha, I made a good point, and then laughed and then didn't push it. And it was like, push it. Like this is where you go through for the throat and just choke him out.
Yeah, he underprepared. No, I don't think he has a read on like his own arguments in terms of which ones are actually worthy of have some meat to them and can actually destroy an argument, as opposed to just straw manning somebody and just saying,
Yeah.
oh, is it yes or no? Is it this or that? Which I find, yeah, less than edifying, shall we say.
Yeah.
But what about cultural Marxism? Do you have any take on this phrase and its use?
Well, it was created by Nazis, so I don't.
Well, that's true.
I mean, like, yeah, it's just a meaningless phrase. It has absolutely no meaning. I mean, it has meaning in the sense that a lot of white supremacists think it has meaning because one of their own came up with it. I can't even remember his name. Lund? Something Lund? I think. But yeah, basically it was just a way of saying, look at these people who want to like bring in degeneracy into our society, and we got to keep our traditional white culture alive, and created cultural Marxism and it basically was a stand-in for Jew, because a lot of these scholars he was objecting to were all Jewish. And so rather than saying, I don't like Jews, he said, I don't like cultural Marxists. And there you go.
And I don't understand. I really like, have tried to work out from the language itself. Cultural, okay.
Yeah.
Things in a culture. I guess that could include society, shall we say, and then Marxism. But Marxism is fundamentally the collective ownership of the means of production. So it just sounds like a really
yeah, but economics are kind of cultural. It's, I guess, because it's related to human beings.
But see, for me, like the word cultural Marxism would be the idea that we should have a society where culture itself is owned by the people and they themselves produce their own culture, which they own the means of production. But that has nothing to do with like degeneracy or the liberal agenda or the homosexual agenda or any of the things that get sort of bunged in with Carl. So it really like the ideas themselves. When you take Marxism as its basis, this is why like I tried to listen to Coach Red Pill and Kevin talk about this, but Coach Red Pill just came across as so freaking smug, and he's just obviously going to get Kevin to acknowledge that the Frankfurt School at one time was a building and society that existed in history. But I still didn't understand his concept of a collective of cultural Marxism. So, I mean, if the idea is that there's a problem with the collective ownership of things that are produced that count as culture,
did Coach Red Pill actually try to make the argument that you're making now, or like?
Well, basically, I think the logic went: the Frankfurt School existed. The Frankfurt School had Marxists in it. People in the Frankfurt School who were Marxists had ideas.
All right.
Other people thought about those ideas and wrote about them. And then a society that kind of had ideas similar to that started to be, come into being in the 1960s or whatever. And then ever since, we've had this problem because of the Frankfurt School. I'm
Oh.
honest, let's attempt to try to understand the connection between the Jewish whatever and the Frankfurt School. Like, that is my honest, most fair attempt to represent the line of reasoning. And this is why I ask people all the time, what does it mean? What does it mean to you, cultural Marxism? Because nobody seems to know.
But I mean, even though like the crowning jewel or crowning jewel of rationality, someone like Bertrand Russell, right? Who I don't think anyone would include as a cultural Marxist in the Frankfurt
No.
School. Back in the 1930s, he won a Nobel Prize for writing the book Marriage and Morals, which was basically about free love and letting gay people do whatever they want. So is
cultural Marxism.
Yeah, like to somehow say that this sort of cultural phenomenon all goes back to the Frankfurt School is just nutty. Just doesn't make any sense.
And yet I still hear about the Frankfurt School as some sort of like, it existed. I think Carol actually said that during the debate with somebody he had, like, oh, the Frankfurt School existed. Like, so what?
Well, yeah,
in my perspective, would exist. That doesn't mean Noah's Ark was a thing.
Yeah.
It's just like, you can't, you have to make the connection besides saying it existed.
Well, I mean, even like some of the, because I think some of the scholars in the Frankfurt School leaned a little more towards some of the relativism that I was talking about in some cases. And I would have objections to that. But like, I worry when people say that somehow because it's so glaringly wrong that we shouldn't have people discussing it in universities kind of weird too, right? Because I don't think that they're so wrong they should be ignored, in the sense that we should have multiple spectrums of beliefs and people arguing for them. And I'll write papers about why they're wrong, and they'll write papers about why I'm wrong, and then we'll figure it out. But even then, like, I don't see why. Like, again, I think the reason why they choose Frankfurt School is because a lot of them were Jews. I honestly think it's that simple. And it's just a base racism, but
possibly. Pascal in the chat says An Actual Joke and Forever James both have amazing videos on the cultural Marxism memes. So I'll go check those out and recommend everybody else do those too. Again, trying to figure out if they called it cultural degeneracy, to be honest, I would understand it a lot better.
I mean, they'd still be wrong, but it would make a lot more sense.
Yeah, because again, I come back to the ownership of the means of production culture. These things don't go together in my head, so it's a block I have.
I guess maybe like somebody like Marcuse liked Marx, so that's like the connection.
Maybe. Who knows? Well, I guess we'll have to do more research.
Yeah, he said Marx in one of his books, so Marxism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap this up, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about in the chat that we haven't had a chance to bring up yet?
In the chat, I haven't had that good of an angle to look at it myself. So.
Oh, so no, I mean just between.
Oh, you mean just like if they ask questions? Yeah.
Well, no, more like since we started the hangout in our chat between us, were there things that you wanted to like talk about on an agenda that we could get through, or have we talked about all the things that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I think that covers a lot of it.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything else. Yeah, it's been great.
It's been really nice. We'll have to do.
I guess maybe if you want to reflect, how does these questions come up in your own sort of work?
Well, I don't know that we really
in like postmodernism, like maybe not cultural Marxism. Just ignore that.
No. Yeah. Anyone in academia seriously writing on cultural Marxism. That's an internet thing.
Yeah.
There's the my approach, I guess, sort of assumes, because my study deals with qualitative data. So we bring them into focus groups from various parties. We ask them standard, questions about leadership evaluations and their perceptions of the campaign, the things that they care about, their predictions for the election. And then we talk to them afterwards to see what their reaction was, like on the day of the election, their experience of voting. Did they have to wait in line? Was it easy or whatever else? And other follow-up questions. So my whole research agenda really revolves around trying to capture data on how people are describing their understanding of politics before Brexit, during Brexit, and then after Brexit in a few years. It requires a postmodern assumption in terms of its methodology and different competing accounts all being equally valid. So it's sort of an assumed part of my research is you don't and we've had our first piece that we submitted based on our focus group data. We got a 3-line, we got like a couple, one revise and resubmit, and then a 3-line rejection that just said, you can't draw conclusions from qualitative data. And like, okay, that sucks. All right, so we sent it to the next journal. And we got like whatever we got back, but we got the exact same 3-line review from the same reviewer with the same objection, just totally cock-blocking us. Just on the foundation that we could not draw any conclusions from what people said about what they thought. And eventually it got published.
Absurd.
Yeah, I know. And so, yeah, there are people out there who say, there's only one way to do political science, and that is through generalizable survey data or panel data or multi-level data, but it has to be data. It has to be numbers. We have to ask people questions and then turn those answers into numbers, and then magically it becomes valid.
I mean, those different types of data sets might limit the kind of conclusions you can draw. But I mean, like, that doesn't mean that qualitative data is therefore bunk or not good.
I point to the example because we looked at leadership evaluations. So in 2010, I would love any political scientist to tell me why there's a difference in believes what he says between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg. And if you say let's say there's a 2.5 point difference, explain that difference. They can't from the data explain that. They can speculate. Gordon Brown was in office, Nick Clegg was this new. Yeah, but that's just stuff you were making up. You're not drawing on the data. You come to my data, and I've got people watching the first live debate saying, Nick Clegg really, he had numbers for things. He had specific policies. He really came across as confident. I can tell you why there's a 2-point difference in that number because I have the data to back it up.
Yeah.
So that's my take on, this is why I'm a methodological pluralist. I think you need to triangulate observations and different theoretical perspectives because human society is so complex. The idea that we could use one theory like economic evaluations to predict vote choice in a presidential election, it just seems to me absurd on its face.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. One last thing on my end that before I forget, because this is just an interesting thing. One other thing that people get worried about, or like the banned postmodernist sort of crowd, right? That don't like postmodernists on campus. I had a professor once that in class, they made the argument that so basically it was a discussion on sociology and it was involving sort of like land claim rights. And the professor had made the argument that since native cultures in Canada, their religious beliefs suggest that they've been here since the beginning of time. And therefore they have a land claim because of that religious belief. And I challenged the professor in that because I was like, well, we have evidence like the land bridge over Alaska and all that fun stuff, the Bering Strait, right? And so like we know that there's other data that sort of like conflicts with this religious narrative. But then I was like, but that claim itself doesn't mean that natives don't have a land claim in any way. I mean, you can still get to be able to support natives if that's your prerogative in that case, right? But you don't need to have to capitulate to this like weird hand wavy religious sort of idea, right? And he sort of like came back and he was like, yeah, but we're like kind of like all of our beliefs are sort of all true. It's that like relativist like position, right? But here's the thing. I wrote my final paper in that class basically criticizing that whole position. And I got a 90% on that paper, right? And I passed the course and he was cool with it. And here's the thing is, not once in that discussion with that professor did I ever get like angry or vitriolic or, right? I mean, so there's this line in which a lot of like people point to these incidences in classrooms where like, say there's some sort of conflict. And it's often because the person deals with it inappropriately. You can disagree with a professor, and if they're a good professor, they're going to listen to you and address and grade your material from a place of respect for you actually struggling with the question and adequately arguing your positions or going through the work, right? And they're not going to like harm you for that. And so like even having these people in the university and like this idea that somehow they're shoving this information down your throat and sort of like indoctrinating all of us is just a load of crap. Like that's not what's happening. And you can disagree with these people and you can still pass and they still love you and everyone's happy. And so it just that whole narrative just frustrates me. It obviously comes from people who just never went to university,
Yeah.
or they went to university and they were just a bunch of assholes, and of course they ran into conflicts. Right?
Yes. I would totally agree with that assessment, because now that I'm on the, in the academic world, when you're a student, you don't see what your lecturer or professor is like at a conference. And you know what happens at conferences? People disagree with each other all the time. And
then they have a drink.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can agreeably disagree. You can respectfully disagree with someone and be their colleague and be their friend and go, no, I'll go buy you a beer. I mean, you're still wrong, but of course the first round's on me. And that's the same kind of approach that they will have with their students. It's not whether or not you tell me I'm right in your essay. It's, can you make a damn good argument? Can you cite your sources correctly? Have you, presented your essay and basically, did you do the work? Did you earn a first or an A or whatever else? That's the question. It's not about the toady thing, because academics are used to being smashed down and having their ideas challenged all the time. It's called peer review.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's called being in a department with other people who disagree with you. I mean, like
exactly.
it's just natural conflict all the time, and that's fine.
In my master's year, and it kind of sadly became less methodologically diverse as time went by, but I remember this particularly because the departmental meetings happened like every Tuesday night or something, and it was kind of like a 3-line whip, they'd say in British sort of parliamentary speak, that members of the department were strongly encouraged to attend the departmental seminar, but then they went out to dinner afterwards to talk to the guest and do collegiate work. The thing about it that I noticed was, in those departmental seminars, a speaker would come and give his or her presentation, and then they would be asked questions by people who were doing political behavior and rational choice theory and democratic theory and ideology, discourse analysis and other quant stuff and democratic theorists and international relations people. And each one of the professionals around that table were bringing information or their perspective from their own discipline. And the person was engaging with a lot of different methodological challenges just from the people in my department. And I was really, really, really proud of that diversity, because I thought it represented the range of academic thought, that does exist out there. And, my PhD supervisor didn't have a particularly high opinion of let's say, Derrida and Foucault and the more obscure modern philosophical writers. And he would say, I have no problem with 2 consenting adults theorizing in private. I just don't think it should be done on the taxpayer's expense. But he was perfectly friendly with all of the members of the ideology, discourse analysis, the staff on that, in that department, because he didn't hold it. It was his personal opinion. He didn't hold it against them personally, and it was a recognized discipline, and they did good job. Leclau was in that department for a while, so yeah, I mean, so he recognized the value of it, even if he personally didn't disagree with it. That happens in academia all the time. So
yep. No, I could. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this has been an absolutely lovely chat. I know we want to have a little chat off air as well, so we'll wrap this up now. But for the 43 geeks in the chat hangout, big high five to all of you. I know Garland was recommending some Deleuze to people to read. Let's see if I can.
He wanted me to read some Henri Bergson as well, I think.
Possibly, yes. So What is Philosophy by Deleuze, and someone named Felix with a last name I'm not even going to attempt on air.
Gudiari? I think it's Gudiari.
Yes, thank you for that, for saving face for me. Go read Hobbes. We'll go watch some videos on Hobbes. He's an awesome political theorist. He's a very rigorous, clearest thinker, I think. It's hard to top Hobbes because he starts with first principles, so he kind of had the easiest job, to be honest, just describing things. But anyway, still a good read, still foundational in terms of the social contract, sort of how we build our societies and the trade-offs that we have between ultimate liberty and then the protections of a collective society. All right.
And if you're feeling risky, give John Rawls give him a go. I really like Rawls. I don't know. The idea of the original position and all that. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. And the veil of ignorance and all that. Yeah. So there's plenty of Rawlsians knocking about in the world. So you have a lot of opportunity. Almost every political theory conference has a Rawls panel.
But that's because of how influential he was. He's a great thinker. Yeah.
Hugely influential. All right, guys, all that's left to be said then is thank you for your time and attention. I do appreciate you guys hanging out for our nerdy little chat. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Everyone in the chat's been awesome. And Jody's been awesome. So then we'll just say goodbye from me and goodbye from Jody. Say bye, Jody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.